Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Hickey. I'm the Human Resource Manager for United Counties Leeds and Grenville. I'm also the Health and Safety Coordinator for this corporation. As a result of the Asbestos Management Program being created, we are here today to roll out this presentation for you to ensure that everyone has the training required under the Asbestos Awareness Program. If you have any questions, you are welcome to contact your Human Resources consultant, your managers, or myself directly. Thank you very much.
Welcome everybody. This presentation today, what we're going to look at is the Asbestos Management Program for the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville. And basically how this all got started is under the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Ontario, one of the employer's responsibilities and duties is to provide workers with what are the hazards you might be exposed to in your workplace, okay? And most of the buildings that Leeds and Grenville operate throughout the region are fairly old buildings, and most of them have asbestos in them. And asbestos is one of the designated substances under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It has its own regulation that we have to comply with, okay? And so what the county did last September, they hired a company called Stantec, and Stantec went through the designated substance regulation for asbestos, and they produced this document called the Asbestos Management Program, okay? It mirrors identically with what we need to cover under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, so it meets all the legislative requirements. And so what we're going to go through today is kind of an introduction to this program and a little bit of background knowledge about what is asbestos and what is it used for. And basically, since we have some of these buildings that have asbestos in them, what's our role to make sure we keep it in good condition? Okay, because that's one of the mandates under the regulation, is we have to make sure our asbestos in our buildings is in good condition and maintained in good condition throughout its lifetime. Okay, so having said that, that's a little bit of the introduction. More specifically, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to learn about asbestos and some of the health hazards associated with it, how and where asbestos is used, what are the legislative requirements for asbestos, and we'll look at the Leeds and Grenville program in a little bit more detail. Okay, and anybody at any time, if you have questions, your first person to contact is your supervisor. Okay, you can ask them this information as well as we're going through. And so hopefully we'll doing this presentation so you've got a good background on what are the risks of asbestos and how is it used and what are we going to be doing with it in our workplaces. Okay, so a little bit of background. Asbestos. Asbestos is found in rocks, okay? And this is a picture of asbestos. It's in the classification called fibrous silicates, and it occurs naturally. And in Canada, we mine asbestos in a couple of provinces, and the type of asbestos that we mine is called chrysotile, okay? And this is what it actually looks like. So that's what we're getting at. And does anybody know what asbestos is used for? Answer. Anybody know what?
Insulation?
Insulation, yeah. Insulation is the best, asbestos is the best fire insulating material that's ever been found, okay? And it's used all around the world. Why it's used? Because of the insulating properties, okay? It is flexible, it is durable, it is chemically resistant, so it doesn't break down if different chemicals get spilled on it. It doesn't react to different chemicals. It is not combustible, which means it won't catch on fire. It's fire resistant. That's why it's used as a fire retardant insulating material. It does not catch on fire. It does not conduct heat, does not conduct noise or electricity. Okay? It is very versatile, it's spinnable, and it has a high strength. Okay, so it doesn't break down easily. Now, this type of asbestos I'm talking about now is the chrysotile asbestos that we mine here in Canada. Okay, and it also has no odor or taste. So if you're thinking about taking a chunk of it and eating it. Don't do that anyway. But it does not have a taste, so take my word for it. There's also this white chrysotile, the white asbestos we mine here. It is long, thin, flexible fibers. Okay, and the big advantage of this type of asbestos is it can be spun or woven. So you see asbestos blankets in restaurants. They used to have a canister that said fire blanket on the outside of it. That was a blanket that had asbestos woven into it. So if someone caught on fire, you wrap them up in the blanket and it snuffed the fire out. But this chrysotile asbestos, these fibers are spinnable. Okay, they can be woven. This type of asbestos, however, can't. This amosite, or it's brown asbestos, this comes from South Africa. The difference with the needles, or the fibers of the amosite, is that they're very straight, very needle-like, and very brittle. Okay? They splinter very easily, so they break, and the problem is once these fibers start to break, we can't see them, they're microscopic, and they can float around in the air and we might inhale them, and that's when asbestos can get dangerous. Okay, so the amosite asbestos, we get that from South Africa. We don't mine it here. And there's also another type called the blue asbestos. This is coming from Australia. It's similar to the brown asbestos I just talked about. Their fibers break very easily as well. Okay, but there are different types of asbestos that we have in our buildings here. Most of the asbestos we have is the chrysotile, the first one that I mentioned. Okay, so Canada is the second largest producer of asbestos in the world. We only produce that chrysotile, excuse me. We export, though, about 95% because changes have occurred since the late 70s that do not allow asbestos to be used in buildings anymore. Okay, and I'll explain that in a minute. But since we can't use it anymore in Canada, we export it a lot now to other places around the world because it's still one of the best insulating materials that's ever been produced and found. So we mine it in Quebec, BC, and Newfoundland. Okay, that little bit of history. In Ontario, we've been using it since the 40s. Okay, it was actually in the building code of Ontario up until the late 60s. Okay, so it was required in the building code that asbestos be put in as insulation in different buildings. Okay, however, there were some diseases that started developing or becoming more aware in the 70s, and they started to take a look at what are some of the dangers of this asbestos that we're using. They stopped the use in the late 70s of asbestos because of these health concerns, and I'll talk about them in a second. Okay? There was a Royal Commission on Asbestos that was set up in 1984, and that in 86, what came out of this was the designated substance regulation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for asbestos. Okay? And so now there is written legislation as of 1986 about how to use asbestos safely and etc. Okay, and it was revised in 2005. Okay, so that's a little bit about the legislation. So how the diseases and stuff started to get reported. Way back in World War I, there were some women that were employed by companies that made gas masks. Okay, and their job was in the lining of the gas mask was stuffed with asbestos, okay, to cut down on the heat and everything else. And that was the only time in their life that they had been actually using asbestos, okay? And so this is back in the 40s, 30s, 40s, back in World War. And so what happened was in the 70s, late 70s, some of these people that were working with asbestos way back when started developing asbestos-related diseases. Okay, asbestosis and dying from these diseases. Okay, the only exposure they ever had to asbestos was when they were working in this gas mask company using asbestos. Okay, so what? And then more and more workers, miners, and whatever started developing these diseases. But the difference with asbestos, if I put my hand in a vat of acid and I take my hand out and my fingers are gone, that's an immediate reaction to that hazard, right? My finger, it happens right away. But with asbestos, it takes anywhere from 20 to 40 years for the symptoms after you're exposed to when the symptoms of the diseases start, okay? And so that's why there was such a delay from when they were working on the gas mask to when they, in the late 70s, when they started developing all these lung problems from the asbestos, okay? That's called the latency period, the time it takes from when you're exposed to when the symptoms of the disease start. And with asbestos, it can be 20 to 40 years, okay? So that's what made it so difficult to pinpoint, you know, how could you get these lung diseases when you only worked with the stuff 20, 30 years ago? Okay, and that's the main reason, because of the latency. Okay, so asbestos was used, and you'll still find it in different equipment, in houses, a lot of homes that you might even be living in now, stucco, in shingles, some of the older products may still have asbestos in them. In our roads, asbestos was mixed in with asphalt, okay, so when they're paving the roads, it was in there. It's in buildings, it's in paints, okay. It was used a lot, as I mentioned, for fireproofing, sprayed on insulation on the underside of tin roofs and whatever, again, because of its fireproofing. It was wrapped around pipes to cut down on the heat, okay. Brake linings of cars, gaskets, there's asbestos types of rope. It can be found in floor tiles, ceiling tiles, okay, and in filters, so it was used almost all over the place. But it started way back in ancient Greece. It was used in the lamp wax in the temples. Okay, the wicks that were in the lamps were made of asbestos, and asbestos is actually a Greek word. Okay, it's for non-extinguishable and indestructible. Okay, that's why it's so popular to use, because it does not break down. Okay, especially if we've got it as insulation, that insulation is going to stay there. Okay, so it's way documented way back. Okay, so in construction, it was found in reinforcement of cement and asphalt, insulating from pipes and boilers. The sprayed on insulation, like I said, it's in floor tiles, shingles of roofs, acoustic tiles, ceiling tiles, architectural finishes like some stucco, it's used for. And also you can get asbestos heat resistant panels or sheets. If anybody had a Franklin fireplace, the fire department tell you you can only have the fireplace so far close to a wall, right, because of the heat transfer. But you can go and you can buy a heat shield. Okay, put that heat shield behind in front of the wall, and then you can bring the fireplace so much closer, because that heat shield contains asbestos and it blocks a lot of the heat transfer to the wall. Okay, so you can still buy these things, even though it's not in the building code anymore. But those heat shields are encapsulated in tin or metal or whatever. Now the asbestos is inside them. Okay, so it's not going to be dangerous to you. Okay, but they are still around. In the automotive industry, it was found in brake linings and brake drums, in transmissions, gaskets, seals, clutches. Okay, so if you were in the automotive manufacturing area, you may have had a higher exposure to asbestos. Okay? They've actually done studies around major highways in Ontario, like the Don Valley Parkway down in Toronto, and they've done air sampling, and they found that there's a higher level of asbestos in the air down by those big highways, because you're putting your foot on the brake all the time and whatever, and you're breaking down pieces of the gasket and the brake linings and whatever. In the textile industry, as I mentioned, it can be found in blankets, theater curtains. Why would they use them in theaters? Obviously for fire, right? If there was a fire, you could close the curtains, and then the curtains won't catch on fire and able to block different areas. Welding blankets as well. Okay, it's used because the chrysotile can be woven. Okay, and that's what the big advantage of it was. way back then. Okay, so we now, where do we usually find asbestos when we go into buildings? In utility rooms, okay, in electrical rooms. If you have boilers and big pipes, usually it's around the pipe wrap. Some tiles in the floor have them. Ceiling tiles, some do, not anymore, but the old ones do. Now, the drywall compound. What the program has done, the Stantec program, they came into the majority of all of our buildings and they took samples. Okay, samples in the wall, in the ceiling, in the floor, all over the place. Okay, all of the samples results are in this document. The documents for the buildings that you guys work in are posted on your bulletin boards, or they're somewhere in your building. Okay, your department managers have a copy of the program as well. So if you ever want to see, you know, in more detail than what we're going through today, you can see that. Of all of the asbestos that Leeds and Grenville have, this is where the majority is found, in the drywall compound. Does everybody know what I mean by drywall compound? Okay, so on this wall, okay, there's sheets of drywall, but in between the sheets, there's a gap, and that's filled with mud. Okay, and the mud is drywall compound. Back in the 70s and 60s, asbestos was mixed into the drywall compound. Okay, and so that's where a lot of it is turning up in the assessments that Stantec did for us. Okay, so if they came in and they did a sample in the middle of the sheetrock, they might not get asbestos. But if they hit the joint, that's when they'll find asbestos. And then they'll assume that all of this room will have asbestos in it, because if it's in this part of the wall, it's going to be in the other parts of the wall too. Okay, so the drywall compound is where a lot of it is. In labs, in the counters in labs, it was mixed in. Pipes, as I mentioned, heat shielding, air handling units. So it was used all over the place, okay, in the past. And here's some pictures. So in this boiler lagging, so the asbestos wrap is all the way around, insulating that in that pipe. Okay, there's different types of wire that has asbestos. Not so much that like asbestos is not in the copper, but it's in the wrapping around the wire. Okay, so again, so if wires are starting to heat up, they're not going to transfer that heat, you know, to the wall or wherever it is, because of the asbestos wrap around it. Okay. Most common, we find it a lot in buried piping. Okay, so this transient pipe, if it's under all of this layer of rock and sand and gravel and whatever, is it dangerous to us? No, because it's buried. Okay, but if we have to dig it up because there's a break in the pipe or something, that's when it could get exposed. Okay, and I'll show you some pictures. So around those pipes, here's the asbestos wrap. Okay, and you can see it's started to what they call becomes friable. So friable is a term that's used for asbestos when it starts to crumble or break down. It also means that asbestos is more dangerous than non-friable. The definition of friable, if I take a piece of it in my hand and push it with my thumb, if it breaks down, if it crumbles, then it's friable. That means that those fibers can get airborne and people can inhale them. Okay? Non-friable means it's in a solid form, they can't break down, they're not dangerous to us. Okay? So you can see around the pipes, around the boiler, the duct work and whatever, it was used extensively. Now, this picture was actually taken in a custodian room in a school. You can see the lagging around this pipe, but it's frayed at the end, it's ripped open, and you can actually see some powder, okay, on the ground. Do you think that would be dangerous? Yeah, because then anybody could inhale this, and so that needs to be cleaned up immediately. Now, when I say cleaning up, only people that are trained in asbestos management can do any asbestos management repairs. Okay? Right now, it looks like any Leeds and Grenville staff are not going to be doing work on asbestos-containing material. That will only be contracted out. Okay? Unless there's some very minor thing that minor repair, but even if it is a minor repair, they will still be trained in how to do that safely with the proper protective equipment if Leeds and Grenville staff are going to be doing that. Right now, no, it's all going to be contracted out. Okay, here's another example. So these pipes that are in the hallway, they're running up and down, they're all coated and encapsulated. The term is encapsulated, so the asbestos wrap, then there's a layer of canvas and then paint on top, but you can see this one's been torn and ripped open. Okay, so the problem stuff is not here. The problem stuff is the asbestos that's been ripped and broken open inside. So that has to be repaired. Okay, and that's a simple repair of putting other insulation in and then rewrapping and repainting and whatever. Okay, that's a possibility. Our staff could do that, but again, only if they've been properly trained. And right now, we're not sure. Okay, lots of the surveys too showed the vinyl tile in a lot of the older buildings contained asbestos. Okay, so, and not only in the tile, but the glue that was underneath the tile to hold the tile in place had asbestos in it. Okay, so if I have a sheet of vinyl tile here, is that dangerous to me for asbestos? No, because the asbestos is compacted inside the tile itself. There's wax and everything else on top of the tile. The only time that could get dangerous is when we start ripping the tile up. If we create dust when we're doing that process, okay, that's when it could become friable. It's not friable, non-friable in this format. Okay. Same thing with ceiling tiles. Okay, so the ceiling tiles in the room here. Some of the old ceiling tiles had asbestos fibers in them. Okay, some of the glue that was on the ceiling that stuck the tiles had asbestos in it as well. All of the ceiling tiles now, no asbestos in them. Okay, so again, in the ceiling tiles, that was an area. If these tiles had asbestos in them, are they dangerous to us now? No, unless we take a saw or some kind of drill or something and start drilling in them, creating dust, making it friable, then it can be dangerous. Okay, but right now, in that format, it's not dangerous to us. Okay, the sheet compound again. So here's an example. You can see on the wall, there's some of the sheetrock that doesn't have the joint compound, but you can see in the joints, that's where all of the asbestos containing joint compound material would be. Okay, and down here is some sprayed on insulation. They used to spray this stuff on in the gymnasiums of schools. Okay, can you see a concern with that? What activities are going on in a gymnasium that could disturb it? Okay, games like volleyball, basketball, any of these things, our ball could go up and hit this stuff and start to break it down. Okay, and then it starts to float around in the air. Right, and if it's light enough to float around, we can inhale it and possibly get sick. So that's why there's a big concern in schools about removing asbestos. Okay, because remember I talked about the latency period, 20 to 30 years. Okay, so if I'm in my 60s, 20 and 30 years from now, for me exposed to asbestos, if I'm still here, is not that bad. Okay, but if I am 8 or 10 years old in a school that's got asbestos floating around in it, 20 to 30 years from then, that's the prime of your life. So that's why there was such a concern about removing asbestos from schools, because of this sprayed on stuff. Okay, there's some more types of the fireproofing. Okay, so the different types again. The chrysotile is in a class called the serpentine asbestos. Has the long, skinny, thin fibers that are flexible and can be spun. Okay. The Affable types of asbestos, these are the very sharp, brittle, needle-like fibers. Much more dangerous, this type of asbestos, because they shatter and you can't see them and you can inhale them. Okay. I talked about the term friable. Okay, so friable means the material that when it's dry can be crumbled, pulverized, or powdered by just hand pressure. Okay, so it's crumbled, pulverized, powdered, and once that happens, it can be light enough to float around in the air, and we can inhale it. Okay, and then it's dangerous. So some of the friable type asbestos, we looked at a lot of the pictures already. Okay, so the friable are the more dangerous ones. Okay, so the lagging, the insulation, the sprayed-on fireproofing, it could be in stucco on the side of a house. Air cell insulation, loose fill. Okay, the non-friable stuff. Okay, the ceiling tiles, the drywall compound, the plaster walls, ceilings, floor tiles, gaskets, etc. They're not as dangerous in its present form. Okay, but the P here means it has the potential to be. Okay, so if we were going to drill a hole in this wall and we happen to hit where the drywall compound is, and we're using an electric drill, we're making it friable from the procedures that we're doing. Okay, so the big part of our asbestos management program and training that's being rolled out is it's really important if we're going to do any construction work in any of the buildings that these samples are looked at, these surveys are looked at and communicated to a contractor that's going to come in, or if we're doing some work internally, we need to know, is there asbestos in this area before we start knocking the wall down or whatever. Okay, and that's where the communication of the survey results is really, really critical. Because we don't want staff being exposed, you know, and they're just asked to go in and put in another box for a phone jack or something like that, and they're drilling in the wall, and they could be creating a lot of danger. Okay, some of the health effects. The major diseases, asbestosis is the main one, and that is a form of lung cancer. Mesothelioma. If you've watched a lot of TV and you'll see in the States, they say, have you been an asbestos worker? We'll sue the company or whatever. And mesothelioma is an awful cancer of the abdominal linings, and so the stomach and the intestines. Okay? And so people were thinking, how the heck would asbestos fibers get into our stomach and our intestines? And what they found out was, if people were working with asbestos, friable asbestos, so fibers are floating around, and if you inhale it, okay, you know all the fluid, the liquid that we have in our respiratory system, the mucus and stuff like that, if those asbestos fibers get stuck in there, okay, so if we cough and you cough up some of that mucus to the back of your throat, what do we do with that? We either spit it out or you swallow it. And then you swallow that mucus that has the asbestos fibers in it, and those fibers get stuck in your stomach or in the linings of your intestines. That's how it got down there. We can understand about getting into the lungs because the primary way asbestos gets into our body is we breathe it in. Because we don't take a chunk of asbestos and eat it and swallow it, but it would be in the mucus, and that's where people weren't wearing the proper protective equipment like a mask or a respirator when they were working with the stuff. Okay, as I mentioned, the number one route of entry is inhalation, so we breathe it in. So we have to, if anybody is exposed to asbestos, we have to make sure they have the proper respirators on. Second route is ingestion. Okay, we don't eat it, but we could swallow that dust, okay, in the mucus and whatever. Or if I had an open cup of coffee and the fibers are floating around, they land in the coffee, then I drink it. Now I'm ingesting those fibers. Okay, and the third route is through absorption. Okay, so there could be fibers that if I'm not wearing gloves or whatever that could get stuck on my skin, and it's very difficult though for a fiber to burrow its way in and get picked up by the blood, but that is why inhalation is number one and ingestion is number two routes of entry. So we just have to make sure that if we are exposed, we have to make sure we're wearing the proper protective equipment. Okay, so asbestos diseases take years to develop. Like I said, 20 to 40 years, that's called that latency period. Okay, so it's a long time and that's from one exposure, okay? But most diseases takes repeated exposures. Okay, so if you were working in the mine every day, then it would be more, because way back when, they didn't have all of the safety procedures about types of respirators and whatever. Okay. The other thing is asbestos is found in the air outside. Okay, so right now, if we brought a hygienist in, they'd do an air sample. If we wanted to know, do we have asbestos in this building, they would go outside first and do a sample and get a reading of how much asbestos is in the air outside the building. Okay, there is asbestos in the air because it's found in rock. Okay, and so then they would come inside and they would take samples inside the building, and then we would find out, is there more inside than outside? If that's the case, then we've got a problem, because there is, some breaking down of the asbestos that we have inside the building. Oops. Okay, so a one-time exposure is a very low risk. If you are a smoker and you work with asbestos, it has been proven to increase your chances of developing asbestos diseases by 70 times, because your lungs are already messed up because of the damage that's been done by cigarette smoke, okay, and smoking. And who knows what will happen after marijuana is legalized. Anyway, we won't go there, that's a different. So lung disease, here's an actual chest x-ray. If any of you have seen a chest x-ray before, it's normally, a healthy lung color is black. Okay, but you can see all of the scarring and everything that's gone on with the asbestos fibers. Okay, so this lung is in really bad shape because of all the scarring that's happened. Okay, so the problem is those fibers that break down. We can't see these guys. 3 microns is so small you have to see them on a microscope. But those fibers can get deep into the inside of the lungs, where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. It's called the alveoli, and that's where they can cause a lot of the damage. Okay, and it really impedes how much air can we bring in and how much carbon dioxide can we take out. So here's again under a microscope. You can see these look like a bunch of needles, and they're sharp and they're very, very brittle, and that's when it's dangerous. Okay, so if anybody had been working with asbestos, these were the symptoms: were shortness of breath, coughing. Sometimes you would have blood in the fluid that is coughed up from the lungs, pain in the chest, especially inhaling and exhaling, difficulty swallowing, hoarseness, weight loss because it's hard to swallow and whatever, because it hurt. Okay, so those were some of the symptoms. So we need to look at, what are we going to do? Okay, and so when the legislation came in that we're not using asbestos anymore in the building code, we had to start eliminating and substituting other products in place of asbestos. Anybody know what they've used instead of asbestos now? Probably all used it in your house. Pink, and it comes in a roll. Okay? Pink fiberglass is an example. So that's replaced asbestos. If anybody's used that stuff, that you need personal protective equipment wearing that, because that can get very prickly, and you can get those fibers in your skin and that too. And you should be wearing a mask or a respirator, because you don't want to be inhaling those fibers either. Okay, so the asbestos that we have in our buildings, our goal is to manage it and maintain it in good condition. We don't want it breaking down. Okay. If we are going to be doing any asbestos work, we have to make sure there are signs posted and people know that work is going on. Okay, all staff are going through this training program. Okay, so that everybody knows about what are the risks of asbestos, what is our asbestos management program, how is it going to make it safe as reasonably possible for us. What are the procedures to follow if we have to do any cleanup, and what types of personal protective equipment. All of that is contained in the document. Okay, so we're not reinventing the wheel. It's in the document, which mirrors what it tells us we have to do in the legislation. Okay, so some of these are the material that have replaced asbestos. So we talked about the fiberglass, there's mineral wool, slag wool, ceramic fibers. Ceramic fibers could be the new thing that we have to keep our eyes open for, because those fibers are very strong too, and they can break. And if they break, what are the health risks with those guys? We don't know yet, okay, because they're still relatively new. Okay, cellulose fiber. Cellulose fiber is what is in the ceiling tiles now. Okay, they're not asbestos anymore, but it looks like if you took a chunk and I showed you some asbestos, you think, boy, they look very similar. Okay, but they're not. Okay, so that's a little bit. Any questions on that little history of asbestos and that? Okay, so what we've done, okay, the Stantec company has done our asbestos management program. The handouts that you have lists the table of contents. Okay, so these are the different sections of the program. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of the sections that are most relevant to us. The asbestos management coordinator is Colleen Hickey. Okay, Colleen is in Human Resources, right? Yeah. And so if there are any questions, first ask your supervisor or get a hold of somebody on your Joint Health and Safety Committee or talk to Colleen. Okay, if you have specific questions about the program. Okay, so the purpose. Okay, the creation and the establishment of the asbestos management program is to minimize the risk and establish control measures for the management of the asbestos materials that are present in our facilities. That's the goal. Okay, we know we've got it. Okay, but so we got to maintain it in good condition, and we don't want it to deteriorate to the point where staff could be at risk. Okay, so that's the purpose. So the objectives are to track and maintain an inventory. So Stantec, they came in and they went through and they took probably hundreds, if not more, samples in all of the buildings. So we have an inventory database now. Okay, then we have to inform everybody in the buildings the locations of the asbestos, and that's what this rollout is doing. There's a list of all the buildings in the handouts that have asbestos in them. Okay, all of the buildings will have the survey results with all of the locations, and I'll show you one in a few minutes and show you how to read those surveys. Okay, we have to monitor the condition of the asbestos through visual assessments. So what that means is we have to check. Okay, if there's asbestos in this wall, which there isn't, but if there is, we have to have some way of checking to make sure the wall is still in good condition. So what we've come up with is the Joint Health and Safety Committees, they do a monthly workplace inspection. Okay, they are going to be given the locations of the asbestos in the buildings that they are responsible for. So when they do their monthly walk around, they will check the condition of the asbestos. Okay, and if there is a concern, if there is a problem, they'll notify their supervisor, who will notify Colleen to get the proper repairs done. Okay, so we're going to meet that objective every month by checking on. The other part is any worker, if they see, a problem, there's a big hole in the wall or something's happened, notify the supervisor right away so we can check, is that an area where asbestos is? Then we have to take the appropriate precautions. Okay. Provide procedures to respond to changes in the condition and properly manage or repair any damage. That's kind of what I just said. Okay, provide procedures to avoid accidental disturbance by controlling access to these materials wherever possible. Most of the asbestos that we have, again, is under tiles, above ceilings, behind walls. It's not, out there. But if we're doing activities where we're drilling or we're doing renovations and stuff, that's when we have to make sure that we're not disturbing the asbestos. And if we are, then we close down the area. We are going to contract out that work for asbestos trained people to come in and do that repair. Okay. And we have to make sure that we are following the legislation which is in our program. Okay, so the scope, building maintenance and management personnel of the locations assessed must become familiar with this program, especially from the maintenance point of view. Okay. Provides guidance to the building personnel and outside contractors when working near asbestos. So if we are going to be contracting with a company to come in and put new computer wires in, we have to look at where are they going to be working, is there asbestos in the area, and we have to inform the contractor because we don't want to be putting them at work or at risk. Okay. So you can see how it's all kind of tied into almost every activity that we do now in our buildings. We got to check, is there asbestos in that area first? Okay, so the asbestos management program provides general information to enable our staff to recognize the hazards, understand the risks, and respond accordingly if there is a problem. Okay, so the hazard awareness prior to conducting any maintenance work. The maintenance supervisors and the building supervisors should determine whether any known asbestos-containing material will potentially be disturbed. That's the big part of this program. So before anything happens, we got to check. Could we be disturbing asbestos? Could we be putting people at risk? So whenever a worker does work on material that does contain asbestos or is assumed, they have to be advised that there is potentially asbestos-containing material. They have to know, is it friable? So that means, is it powder-like or non-friable, which isn't as dangerous, told of its location, and what type of a, okay? The program outlines what are the roles and duties for all staff. Okay, the senior employers, the asbestos management coordinators, or Colleen, supervisors, joint health and safety committees, their big role is in the workplace inspection. Maintenance staff, again, would be to check the area surveys first before they start doing work. And then there's roles for the contractors who would have to come in and do the asbestos work for us. Okay, and these are all spelled out in the program. Joint health and safety committees, as I mentioned, they're participating, involving the, if there is any work going to be done, the committee needs to be known. Any training aspects of it, again, the committee gets involved with. If we're going to be doing any asbestos related work, it has to go through the committee so that they can pass that information on. Okay, and this is the big part for them, is the monthly workplace inspections. Okay, to look at the condition in the areas. And then if there are any concerns, report them right away to their supervisor or to Colleen. Okay, the inventory that was done, I mentioned it was through Stantec. They've done the complete assessment. They've recorded the location of all friable and non-friable. Doesn't matter if it was asbestos-containing material, it's recorded. It shows up on the sample. There's a process for updating the inventory. It hasn't been totally worked out. If we're doing, every year, there's a few buildings that didn't get sampled, so they will be the next ones to get sampled. Okay, and in your handouts again, all of the buildings that were surveyed are noted in the handouts, and is there asbestos in that building, yes or no, and what kind, and whatever. Okay, so this record keeping is an ongoing process for asbestos. It's involved in any plans. Anytime we're going to do any renovations and whatever, we have to check back in this program. Are we going to be going into areas that have asbestos? Okay, we have to update them. We have to make sure the committees are doing their inspections and making sure that the areas that have the asbestos in are in good repair. Okay, there are copies of all the work procedures. If you guys all signed a training sign-in sheet, so we know that all staff have been trained in this program. Any staff that have to do any more in-depth work on asbestos will receive any other, specific training, if they're going to be doing that. And if they are, then we would make sure that they're getting the proper medical surveillance. One of the things that they ask people that work with asbestos is to have an annual chest x-ray, just to check to make sure that your lungs are still in good condition. Okay. Then we'd have to make sure we got the proper protective equipment, respiratory protective equipment, etc., if our staff are doing that. Okay. Okay, so we are assessing it. The only way to know for sure if there's asbestos in the wall is to survey it. Okay, that's the only way that, and if to err on the side of safety, we would assume that there is asbestos. If there's a little bit over there, chances are there's going to be some over here. So we assume that the room has it. Okay, but we want to find out what's the condition of it. are any of our staff at risk with this asbestos that's in that particular area. Okay, we don't want people to panic. That's why we're doing this training, okay, and rolling it out to all staff in all departments. You know, casual staff, full-time staff, part-time, whatever, need to know, is there asbestos in the area that I'm going to be working? Okay, what condition is it in? So we're being proactive here. We're identifying, now that we know where everything is, we're letting everybody, keeping them up to date. There's emergency procedures in place if something goes wrong. There are contractors that we would call in if there is a problem. Okay, and this just goes through the contractors. The type of work on asbestos, they break it down into type 1, type 2, type 3. That's all outlined in the program. Type 1 is the minor, type 3 is major. Any company that, as an asbestos abatement company, that's asbestos removal, have to produce training documents from the Ministry of Training, colleges and universities to prove their staff have taken asbestos removal training. And they have to prove that. So if we are contracting with XYZ company to remove asbestos, for our due diligence is we want to make sure their staff are trained in how to do this. Okay, and that's not so new. That's been around since 2007. Okay, so we want to make sure that they have all their training. So they're not only not putting themselves at risk, but not putting our staff at risk if they're not doing it properly. Okay, so I mentioned the type 1, type 2, type 3. So for all asbestos workers, you need to know what are the hazards, okay, and the safe operating procedures and how to clean your material. And again, that's not going to be applied to our staff, okay? That's only for the people that are going to be coming in to do it. What you might see is a sign, okay? If there was asbestos in here and there's workers in, you'll see a sign, okay, like there's asbestos work going on. And if there's any waste material, it's usually in a bag like this. And one of the reasons it's a good idea to use contractors to do this is then it's their responsibility, okay? They've created the asbestos waste, it's in all these bags. It's their responsibility then to transport it to the dump to get it looked after. Okay, if we were doing all this, we would have to have these bags, we'd have to store them somewhere. Our staff then would have to be trained in how to transport with transportation of dangerous goods legislation. So it's much better if we contract this work out, which we are going to do. Okay, so we don't have, but you might see those bags, and so that's why I'm showing you. Okay, so the program review, so the Joint Health and Safety Committees will be updated if there's any changes at all to the program itself. Okay, so this is a lifelong program. Okay, this isn't a one-shot thing. As long as there's asbestos in our buildings, we have to properly maintain it. We have to properly assess it all the time. Okay, and if there are changes to it, then we have to react. Okay. The Asbestos Records, Colleen will have all of these. Now, this is the sample. You guys have a copy, not of this one, but of a sample. But if you can you guys read that? Can you see that? Okay. So this is a sample of the sample page of one area. This was in 105 Lewis Street, okay, in Merrickville. So it is detailed enough that it looks at this location was in the floor, and the asbestos containing material was underneath the floor tile. Underneath the floor tile. So is that dangerous to us? No. Okay? And the asbestos type was the glue that was holding down the floor tile. Okay? And so it said approximately how much. Is it friable? See the word friable right? Pointer right there. And it says no. Is it visible? No. Okay? And then accessibility. And it says a D. Now, at the bottom, it tells us about and if you look at the bottom of your handout, you'll see accessibility. Okay, it's right there. It's on the sheet that looks like that. That's on the wall. It says accessibility. If there's an A the area of the building within reach, so from the floor to about this high, would be an A. So if the asbestos was right here, that would be called an A classification for accessibility. Okay. B, frequently entered maintenance areas. So if it's in a boiler room or a maintenance room, then it would be a letter B. C, areas of the building above 2.4 meters where a ladder is required. So if it's up on the ceiling, then it would be a C. Okay? And D are areas of the building behind inaccessible areas, like under the floor, above the ceiling, like this one is. It says it's a D because it's under the floor tile. Okay, so that's what the accessibility code is looking at. Okay, so another area was the walls, ceilings, and bulkheads. The drywall joint compound contained the asbestos, and it was 1% chrysotile. Okay, it is not friable, but it is visible, and it's within, like the wall. Okay, so that's what the letter A is there. Now here's an interesting one. There's asbestos in the fire-rated doors, okay, that we have all around the buildings, okay, because asbestos was built into those doors. Okay, so if the asbestos is in that door, is it dangerous to us? No. Okay. So it is not friable, but it is visible because it's a door and it's in there. Okay, so more drywall compound and more glue. Okay, and so those were the, but they've gone through all the buildings, and there's a summary sheet for every floor of every building. Okay, and those should be posted in your work areas so all staff know that these are the areas. Okay, now I can go. So that's the video program. If you have any questions, you're asked to contact your supervisor and your Joint Health and Safety Committee or Colleen Hickey, who is the Asbestos Management Coordinator. Okay, thank you for your attention.